How have the exam boards responded to the DFE subject content and the Ofqual documents? This is one of several videos where I will compare their approach. You can get links to the specifications, AQA, Edexcel. At the moment the EDUCAS has removed its draft. I'm sure that once it's accredited you'll be able to get a link there. Ever so important, I feel, to look at the actual sources. Personally, I've printed them all off. I've got them into about, I'm just looking at about, I don't know, 10 different documents. I like to be able to leaf through it, but otherwise look at it online. I've done an at a glance difference between them all. This is on my Blogspot. Eventually I'll probably sort out getting myself a website, but until then, if you go to that particular page within my Blogspot, which was in June 23, that's where I'll put any links to anything that I do and anything that I do as an update. So this is a two-sided A4 document which you can just download, where I've got a specification comparison at a glance. So there you've got on the first page the themes, and the second page the various elements of the exam and how they're different for, first of all, AQA, Edexcel and EDUCAS. These are the 14 areas that I've identified as to where exam boards may differ, and I'm making videos for the sections. First of all, this one's going to cover 1 to 5, so looking at the approach, whether it's inclusive, any admin issues, allocation and weighting of assessment objectives, and criteria. Then I'm going to make separate videos for all of the ones in purple. So one just about the themes, listening, dictation, reading, translation, speaking, writing, translation, and support from the board. I would remind you, though, yet again, about this work in progress, where I've, as well as that at a glance, I've done a really, really detailed document where I look at every element. So that's written down. The video is really just going to be, I suppose, walking you through those. But for the real detail, look at the document. Of course, some things are in common because of that DFE subject content, but that is less so than in 2008 or 2018. There are more differences now. I think there are some significant variations between, I've put drafts there, but that's through the final one for Edexcel and AQA and the draft of EDUCAS. Reminder of what the document looks like, which you could, if you want to, you can be looking at that. Firstly then, the approach of the exam board. Here are some variables. When you're comparing it with the current approach that they take, it could be that they're deliberately going for something which you will find familiar. The argument being this is going to be much easier for you. You can use resources that you're already using. The layout of the paper is similar to how you would expect. Or it could be that you deliberately want a change and you want to go something which is unfamiliar, not the way that you're doing things at the moment. It could be that it matches the established progression that you've got at the moment, or it could be a new progression. And I suppose this is particularly being open about it. It is open that a lot of these changes were made because of people wanting to change the way that they taught, and they wanted an exam to match that. And that should happen, that those people who have gone for the NSELP method of teaching will have an exam in EDUCAS which will match what they've been doing. Another approach could be the way that they've consulted with teachers and indeed students beforehand. It could be that they've been particularly open to everybody. Anybody could go along and say what they wanted about what should happen to the exam. It could be that they've selected particular people to speak to. And I know that there, for example, AQA had open meetings where anybody could go along. Edexcel selected particular groups of people, I suppose getting a broad range of opinions as to what should happen, including and really for both of them you can see they've really have consulted with a lot of people and with a lot of students. What about the admin or the organisation of the papers? Well, there at the moment with the EDUCAS draft it says there are 3, but I noticed that an announcement refers to writing as component 4. So I've got a feeling that that may come into line with the others. So it may be that in the end everybody has 4 of the listening, speaking, reading and writing. We'll see about that. The number of sets which have been given for speaking in the sample assessment materials, you have 9 for AQA, 6 for Edexcel and 3 for the draft EDUCAS. Invigilation, that's something which I don't think has had a difference before, but I noticed that in the EDUCAS draft it requires a non-specialist to be invigilating, whereas that isn't the situation for AQA and Edexcel. Access and inclusivity. This is something which is really key at the moment, isn't it? In anything that comes out, quite rightly, there is a particular emphasis on making sure that people will feel included, that everybody has access to it. And this is something where I would say that the boards have taken this very seriously. The drafts were already good and inclusive, I feel, and I noticed that after Ofqual had looked at them, that they had been improved even more so, I feel. But you look at it, you see what you think. When you look at the tasks and the photos and the conditions, are they going to include everybody, or might they exclude some people? My personal view is, when I looked at it, the photos all represent a whole range of people. So I feel, and in particular as well, when it comes to the tasks, I noticed that things which might have related to and assumed a nuclear family or assumed that people go on holiday had been removed. So certainly when I looked at the tasks, they seemed to be inclusive, but that's for you to look at for your setting. The next one is choice or no choice. AQA and Edexcel now have brought in much more choice when it comes to the tasks. Sometimes there isn't a choice, so when there isn't a choice, that's where I think for you to look at it carefully and think, well, have they thought through this? Will everybody be involved? By the way, the noise in the background is it started pouring with rain here on a glass roof. What else have we got? Progression. This is something where I think this is with the current GCSE as well. A decision has been made. AQA have what they call peaks and troughs within a steady incline of difficulty, whereas for Edexcel and the draft EDUCAS, each exam becomes increasingly harder. Now, if you go to the sessions led by the leaders, they will tell you that that's what pupils told them that they wanted. So that's showing that there are differences. There are some people who prefer one or the other. The argument for the peaks and troughs with steady incline is that you can possibly keep people going a little bit longer, as long as you as the teacher tell them and say, look, you might find one that's quite difficult, but know that at the end there will be ones which you can manage as well. So the idea that it would keep them awake and alive and keeping going. Whereas Edexcel and EDUCAS may well argue, well, that way people know at the beginning of the test, when they're feeling fresh, that's when they're going to be able to do their best, and they will understand that it's going to get harder. So the other thing you could look at is, through the specification, I found that the exam boards are being much more explicit about their rationale for the approach towards various tasks, and that can be in the specification itself. Also, I mean, AQA has also included a very, very full commentary on every single question, so you can see what the rationale was behind that question. So they both give more information. That's something which was required by Ofqual, and I think that's really helpful as teachers to be able to look from the outset to see what was behind this. Sometimes we don't necessarily have when I was at college, I didn't necessarily have that amount of training on writing effective, valid, reliable assessments. I think it's really, you can learn an awful lot by analysing assessments and reading about the rationale. That then obviously will help you when you come to, well, first of all, make your decisions. That might affect your decisions, but also when you come to prepare sample assessments yourself. Assessment objectives. Right. So here with the assessment objectives, I'll talk about it in a bit more detail another time, but look at it and you can see that because of the way that some of the skills were brought together in 3 assessment objectives, some boards have put more weighting on certain elements than others. There's been that freedom. Before, it was just clear cut. Everyone was listening 25%, speaking 20%. Well, actually it was 20 to 30%, but in the end it turned out that everybody went for 25% for all of the skills. Here, 25% for all of the skills, and then across the skills there had to be a weighting for grammar. But here, when you look at it, you'll see that there are differences. So one thing I've picked out here is for the grammar. Grammar now includes sound, spelling, correspondence. So they've lumped together being grammatically accurate and being phonetically accurate. And overall, I would say it's weighted towards writing for the AQA and weighted towards speaking for the Edexcel. So you have more AO3 marks for the writing for AQA than for Edexcel. But when you look at the sound, spelling, correspondence, that's where within the AO3 there are more marks for sound, spelling, correspondence than for accuracy with Edexcel. Whereas with the AQA and EduCAS, within the AO3, there are proportionately more marks for accurate grammar rather than phonetics. They are very slight differences, but it's something which you might want to look at. The rationale given, I assume, would be that AQA would say when you're writing, you've got a bit more time to reflect on the grammar, so perhaps it's fairer to test it that way rather than when you're speaking. For the Edexcel, their argument, I expect, would be there's this big emphasis on phonics now. You want to be able to give a reward for that in the writing and the speaking. So this is just to show you how things change if you're interested. So this is AO's computer. AO is awarding organisation. It's also assessment objective. So here I've put down for each of the AOs, so AO1, which is understanding and responding to spoken language in speech and writing. So that's your listening and your interactive speaking. AO2 is understanding and responding to written language in speaking and writing. So that's your reading exam and the writing exam, and also speaking when you're not interacting with somebody. And AO3 is where you're showing this knowledge and application of grammar and vocabulary, but also that includes phonetics, the phonics. So that's how it was before, and you can see there were some differences, and then actually this looks a bit of a muddle, but believe me, afterwards there were some changes, and in particular I noticed, and I think there's a mistake here, that Ofqual changed the allocation of some of the assessment objectives. So for AQA they changed the role play from AO1, which is interactive, to AO2, which is where you have a text and you speak. You don't have to bother about what anyone says to you. And I think that's correct. That was changed to AO2 because you don't have to understand anything the examiner says in order to be able to perform. But Edexcel, who I think rightly had put the role play in AO2, in other words, you're not interacting, you're not responding to speech, you're just speaking, they were told to put it to AO1, so that is a bit perplexing. And there were some changes to the weighting, and that's where I've just mentioned this, where AQA have transferred some of their grammar marks, so there were 5 from the speaking, so they had more grammar in the photo speaking than they do now, and they put them into writing, so they've got a bit more of the grammar in the writing now than they had in the speaking. Criteria. What about criteria? I think this is really, really important to be able to understand this. I think I mentioned this right at the beginning of this little video, so I won't go over it too much, but ever so important you understand it. And you'll notice that there are some differences. Sometimes they're holistic, so in overall, how have they done on a particular element, or it can be targeted where they're saying how many words have to be accurate, for example, how many chunks have to be correctly translated. So that's something which, when you look at, it may be that you think one or the other is something you understand better, which you can apply, or you can prepare your students better for it. I've put as the next one, are the definitions clear and consistent or unclear? That's something which I've kept from when I did this exercise looking at the drafts, because there were some which I felt were inconsistent. I think now that they are much better, and I would say that they're all pretty clear and consistent. You have definitions for all of these elements which in the past we've said, well, what does it mean if it's some or if it's often? What's the difference between it, or what is clear and unclear? You'll find now, I think, when you look at it, that they really have thought about this. Another thing, exemplified or not exemplified. I think that's really important, that you can see, what does the exam board actually mean? Show us what a perfect piece of writing would be to get full marks for this. And perhaps more difficult, but they've done this, is when it comes to the speaking. Can you give us indication as to what it would be that would mean that something lacks clarity? So I feel that when you look at it, if you haven't looked at it already, you'll find that that's really very helpful to do that. But there may be some which you find are more useful than others. So in the analysis I've done, I've looked at each set of the criteria, sad little person that I am, and yeah, how well could you explain it to the learners? How well could you defend it if you're challenging results? And here's an example of how I've got 3 slides to show you how things changed on the criteria. So this is how it was before it was accredited. And then here, when Edexcel had been accredited, I changed it, and you can see the sorts of things they did. So instead of having full coverage of required information, it went to all 3 bullet points addressed. Oh, by the way, this is the foundation writing question 2, where you've got 3 bullet points for Edexcel, 5 for AQA. And then, yes, so really, what have we got here? It's addressing the bullet points being explicit in the criteria. So I think very often, I'm sure that we all, with the current criteria, worked out how many bullet points need to be covered. But I think it's great that now you've just got it there. It's explicit. It's in the criteria. Also here, they've gone away from coverage of required information to they are addressed. So I think that's more straightforward. Then when it comes to the word of development, they've added development of ideas. I'm not sure that I really understand why that makes it better, but they do define then what development is. Communication is a word which people tend not to like nowadays in Ofsted, for example, or Ofqual. Here it's seen as being a bit of a woolly skill. So here, most of the response is comprehensible. And that's what communication is, isn't it? That somebody, you manage to communicate your idea. Most of it is understandable. And then the word ambiguity, rather than using the word ambiguity, they've said some messages may be unclear instead of there's some ambiguity. And then how did it happen with AQA? What did they do to change that? I mean, that's what it was before. They had the same words of coverage and communication. They were specific underneath as to how many bullet points were needed. So that was done as a footnote. But now you can see that it's brought into line with what has been recommended for Edexcel as well, that it'll say, for the first one, all 5 bullet points are covered, and the next one will be at least 4, at least 3, at least 2, at least 1. And actually they have kept the word communication here. Communication is clear. So that's, yes, I've just put there, they've allowed coverage. It's not been changed to address. So I think it must have been different people advising them on this. But the word ambiguity, if you see beforehand, you had this word ambiguity, occasional ambiguity, that as well has been changed to lapse in clarity. Although, again, sad person I am, I know that in another lot of criteria they did allow the word ambiguity.